Well, greetings, River Oaks. It is time for our ninth installment of our Sunday School Snippets as we are working our way through this very fascinating and challenging book of Micah. And for the last two snippets, including today, we'll be in the final chapter of Micah. And for this one, we'll take a look at the first 10 verses. And in it, it's quite interesting. Micah reflects on the personal and sort of corporate implications or the results of God's judgment that he is bringing upon the kingdoms of Israel. If you recall, a big part of Micah's message has been largely negative, promising that God, because of the sin of his people and their idolatry and so forth, is going to bring the judgment of exile with all of the devastating consequences, both on the northern kingdom, which has been Micah's main goal or main focus, as well as for the southern kingdom of Judah, which Micah has had a message for, but that hasn't been quite at the center of his target, so to speak. And it's quite an interesting passage today. And so I'm going to flip the screen over and take a look at it, and we'll see what Micah has to say in light of the impending judgment. So let's take a look at the passage. It's Micah 7, verses 1 through 10. Woe is me, for I have become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires. You can almost say it as in sort of contemporary, to contemporize this, we could say, I have become like the grocery store aisle where there is no paper towels or no wipes or no toilet paper. It's all been picked clean. That's in effect what he is getting at here with this first bit here. But he personalizes here, that's a metaphor, he personalizes it, makes it more realistic. He says in verse 2, the godly has perished from the earth, and there is no one upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net. It's almost like we've descended into, World War Z or I Am Legend or all the other sort of, recent Hollywood movies about global zombie apocalypse and so forth, much like Elijah will in the book of Kings. Here Micah is saying, look, it seems like I'm the only one left who follows God. Everyone else has turned tail. They've turned evil against God. There's no one upright among us. In fact, he goes on and makes it even worse. He says, the best of them, if you look at all of the people who are left in light of God's judgment of exile, the best of them is like a briar, which is not a positive description. The most upright among the people who are left is like a thorn hedge. Maybe they even look like flowers, but actually they have prickles. It's like everybody is a wasteland. It's almost like I'm the last one standing. So if that's the case, as he describes this devastating social effect of God's judgment, it's not surprising, I suppose, that he says this. If that's true, if you can't trust anyone, put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend. Why? Well, the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. Things are getting very, very bad for the people of Israel, according to Micah. And there's a lot of tremendous, almost sort of sociological insight that Micah is getting at here. He says, look, when judgment comes from God, when things get really, really bad, when the external environment gets so severe that you have foreign nations breathing down your neck and so forth, oftentimes that brings out the worst in otherwise seemingly good people. He says, look, things get so bad when people sort of almost metastasize in their fear and the anxiety and their sin that's sort of made worse by this, that even sons rebel against their fathers, even daughters raise up against their mothers. So it's sort of a worst case scenario. If you look at certain parts of our country, people are reporting on their neighbors for going for a walk and sending pictures into governors and saying these people aren't social distancing, and how very quickly at times the coronavirus outbreak has turned people into sort of snitches on one another. This is that times, a factor of 2 or a factor of 3. He says, look, things are so bad that we're all just devouring one another. Now, this isn't just an Old Testament message. You can see in the slide here, I have suggested that you take a look at Jesus' own description of this same kind of crisis in Mark chapter 13 and the parallels in Matthew and Luke, the so-called discourse on the Mount of Olives, or the Olivet discourse, where Jesus says, look, he uses actually the same kind of pattern, almost the same kind of language. He's not directly quoting Micah, but he's drawing on the same principles, where he says, look, when the crisis comes, when God's judgment is so intense and so severe, and there's persecution, there's famine, there's war, there's upheaval, which really characterizes the entire period of time from Jesus' first coming to his second coming, although according to Micah, it's characterized the entire period of time since Adam. When that happens, it often brings out the worst in people, even to the point of dividing families. He says in the Olivet Discourse that, again, same language, sons will rebel against fathers, daughters will turn against their mothers, that even family structures will break down. And so we look around us at various points in history, and we can see crisis sometimes brings out the best in people, but sometimes it can bring out the worst. But Micah turns here in verse 7. He says, as for me, when everyone else is falling apart, what does a true worshiper of God do? He says, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. I will wait for my God who will hear me when I cry. The great hope for a Christian isn't the police, isn't tracking, isn't data, isn't fixes to the social problems, although we do pray for those. The great hope for the Christian is the Lord our God, the God of our salvation. So it's a fascinating move from crisis to what the hope is for a Christian there in verse 7. When does it stop? He describes a bit more of this, and I want to land on verse 9 here. Just for the interest of time, we can't cover everything in detail. Verse 9 and verse 10 are similar. I'll just focus on verse 9. Micah says, I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light, and I shall look upon his vindication. It's a brilliant passage where, as a believer in Yahweh, Micah says, look, I know I too have sinned. Though I cling to God, I know that I deserve his indignation. And in life, even though the Christian gospel says that your sins can be paid for, and all those truths, and all that's true, and Micah would assent to that as well. It's the whole sacrificial system of Israel was pointing towards. But there's a kind of element of Christian maturity that reminds us that our sin does bring consequences. It can bring just indignation from the Lord. That God can justly, even in his fatherly kindness, pour out consequences on us that our egregious sins against him aren't neutral. That even though he may forgive us, there still may be consequences. In fact, the great hope of Micah is he says, look, I can man up and bear my own, the thing that I brought on myself. I need to stand up and take that like a man, so to speak. But I still plead with God that he would execute his judgment for me and bring me out of the darkness into the light, and that I shall, when that happens, look upon his vindication as a holy and good God, that he will spare me the worst of his indignation. And that is a clear gospel arc in Micah. Then on the one hand, as Christians, we know if you do X, Y, and Z, there are going to be consequences, and that God is not wrong for imposing temporal consequences, just like he did on Israel, just like he did on Judah, just like he does in each of our lives individually. But the great hope of the gospel is that someone else, namely Jesus, stands in our place to bear the fullness of that indignation. In fact, as we've seen in Romans, on the one hand, God remains just for sin, that he has to be vindicated in his own holiness, that he has to judge sin. But the way he can then be justifier of we who have sinned against him is actually pouring out the fullness of his wrath on a substitute. And that's the great hope of this message that Micah is anticipating, that we come out of the light because of one, that God would, in the fullness of time, send in the person of his son, who would bear the fullness of that indignation on our behalf, bringing us out of darkness into the light, that he would be the means of God's own vindication, as Micah says. And so it's a beautiful anticipation of that gospel arc, so to speak, that trajectory from our own personal sin and its own immediate consequences to the great hope of someone who would bear that sin and the eternal consequences. So we'll finish up Micah next time around. Hopefully this has been helpful as we have taken a look at the first half of chapter 7. Take care.